Welcome to the Compliance Officer's Playbook podcast. Today we're doing a deep dive into something really important for all of you in the compliance world, AI law. We're going to be using this Global AI Law Snapshot to break it all down. And let me tell you, getting up to speed on this is crucial. AI is everywhere, but the laws are still being written. It's almost like we're figuring out the rules of the road while we're driving.
It is a very dynamic landscape, that's for sure. And what's fascinating is that different regions are tackling it in vastly different ways. The EU, China, the US, they're each taking their own path.
It is fascinating. If you ever wondered if there's just like one big law that governs all things AI, like you open a giant book and boom, there it is.
Well, that would certainly make things simpler. But the reality is it's not that straightforward. We see a spectrum from comprehensive laws that cover AI really broadly, like the EU's AI Act, to narrow laws that focus on specific industries or applications.
So the EU's going for a broad strokes approach. Tell me more about this AI Act. What's the main idea behind it?
Well, the EU AI Act is really groundbreaking. It's the world's first comprehensive AI law, and it's already in effect. Their goal is human-centric and trustworthy AI, which is woven throughout the entire legislation.
Okay, human-centric and trustworthy AI. That sounds good in theory, but how does it actually work in practice?
Well, it covers a really wide range of AI applications and focuses on risk management. The Act divides AI systems into different risk categories, from unacceptable risk, things that are outright banned, to high-risk applications that face really strict requirements.
So they're not just saying no AI, but rather use AI responsibly.
Exactly. And that means putting safeguards in place to mitigate any potential harms and protect fundamental rights.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've got the EU taking this big, comprehensive approach. What about China? How are they handling AI law?
Well, China's taken what we call a vertical approach. They've implemented several AI laws, each dealing with a specific area. For example, they have one law regulating deep synthesis technology, which is what's used to create deepfakes.
Deepfakes. Those are so unsettling. And they're becoming more and more realistic. It's good to hear they're being addressed specifically.
Right, and they have other laws covering algorithmic recommendations. Think about how platforms like TikTok serve you content, and generative AI services like ChatGPT.
So China's approach is more like a toolkit
Yeah.
with specific tools for specific AI challenges.
Yeah.
What about the U.S.? Where do they fit in all of this?
The U.S. has taken a different path. You might call it a patchwork approach. Instead of crafting new AI-specific laws, they're relying on existing laws that are relevant to AI, but weren't originally designed for it.
So they're trying to adapt existing legal frameworks to this new technology. That seems like it could get complicated quickly.
It can be a challenge. For instance, they use the FTC Act, which prohibits deceptive practices to regulate AI in advertising. Then you have laws like the Fair Credit Reporting Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which apply when AI is used in financial decisions.
So a bit of a mix and match situation in the U.S. But haven't there been some recent moves in the U.S. that are specifically aimed at AI?
There have been. The National AI Initiative Act of 2020, while not a comprehensive law like the EU's, shows that the U.S. is paying attention to AI at the federal level.
Right. And wasn't there also an executive order from former President Trump about AI leadership? That seems relevant.
You're absolutely right. That executive order focused on removing barriers to American innovation in AI and maintaining the country's global leadership in the field. It highlighted the strategic importance of AI from a U.S. perspective.
So there's definitely a push in the U.S. to support AI development. But what about the flip side? The risks. AI is powerful. What happens when things go wrong? Who's held responsible?
You've hit on a key point that keeps many businesses awake at night: liability. It's a complex issue, and again, different regions have different approaches.
Okay, let's dive into that. Let's say an AI-powered medical device malfunctions, or a self-driving car causes an accident. Who takes the blame?
Well, in the EU, the existing Product Liability Directive currently covers AI and software, but they're also developing a new AI Liability Directive to specifically address the challenges of AI-related incidents. This new directive is a big deal because it really grapples with the nuances of AI and how to assign responsibility.
So the EU is taking concrete steps to clarify who's liable when AI systems cause harm. How does that compare to the U.S.?
In the U.S., there aren't specific laws yet that directly address AI liability. They still rely primarily on existing product liability laws, which, as we've discussed, weren't designed with AI's complexities in mind.
So figuring out liability in the U.S. could be a bit of a legal puzzle then.
It can certainly be more complex, relying on interpretation and precedents. This lack of specific AI liability laws creates some uncertainty for companies operating in the U.S.
It sounds like the EU is taking a much more proactive stance on this issue. They're really out in front trying to establish a clear framework for AI, while other regions are taking a more wait-and-see approach.
That's a fair assessment. The EU's AI Act is definitely a landmark piece of legislation. It'll be interesting to see how it influences AI law development around the world.
It's a lot to think about. This global AI chess game is getting more complex by the day. But let's take a pause here. We'll pick up this discussion in part 2 of our deep dive and explore some real-world examples of AI law in action. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Compliance Officer's Playbook podcast. Before we paused, we were discussing the different approaches to AI law globally. Now let's zoom in on a specific aspect, the concept of prohibited AI. This is where it gets really interesting.
Prohibited AI, it does sound a bit ominous, doesn't it? What exactly does that entail?
Essentially, it's about drawing a line in the sand. The EU's AI Act, for example, has a list of AI applications that are strictly forbidden due to ethical concerns, potential societal harm, or security risks.
So they're saying some uses of AI are simply off limits. Can you give me some concrete examples of what's on this forbidden list?
Absolutely. One example that stands out is the use of AI for social scoring. Imagine a system that ranks citizens based on their behavior or characteristics, potentially limiting their access to services or opportunities based on an algorithm's judgment. The EU AI Act recognizes this as a clear threat to fundamental human rights.
Yeah, it sounds like a dystopian science fiction scenario. I can see why that would be a hard no. What other types of AI applications are banned under the EU AI Act?
Another key prohibition is the use of AI systems for real-time biometric identification in public spaces for law enforcement purposes. This refers to things like facial recognition cameras being used to constantly track and monitor people without their consent or knowledge. The EU is taking a strong stance against this due to serious concerns about privacy violations and mass surveillance.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? AI has the potential for so much good, improving safety, efficiency, all sorts of things. But then you have the potential for misuse, infringement on people's rights.
Precisely. And that's why clear legal frameworks are so crucial. They help ensure that AI is developed and used responsibly, ethically, and in a way that benefits society as a whole.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got prohibited AI,
Right.
the things that are completely off the table. But what about AI systems that are considered high risk, but not outright banned? How does the EU AI Act address those? That's where the concept of high-risk AI comes in. The AI Act categorizes certain applications as high risk based on their potential impact on fundamental rights, health, safety, or the environment. For these systems, the Act imposes strict requirements throughout their entire life cycle, from design and development to deployment and ongoing monitoring.
Can you give me a few examples of what would fall under that umbrella of high-risk AI? Certainly. One prominent example is the use of AI in critical infrastructure, like energy grids or transportation systems. Imagine an AI system controlling a power grid malfunctions, causing widespread blackouts. The consequences could be devastating. Similarly, AI in healthcare is considered high risk, especially when it comes to applications like diagnosis, treatment recommendations, or surgery. The stakes are incredibly high in these areas.
It's easy to see why those applications would be classified as high risk. You're talking about potential life or death situations. So what kind of safeguards does the EU AI Act put in place for these high-risk AI systems?
The Act includes several key requirements. For starters, developers of high-risk AI systems must implement robust risk management systems to identify and mitigate potential harm. They also need to ensure data quality, addressing potential biases in the data that could lead to discriminatory outcomes.
So it's not just about the AI itself, but also about the data that feeds it.
Exactly. The old saying, garbage in, garbage out, applies to AI as well. Additionally, transparency is essential. Developers must provide clear information about how their AI systems work, enabling users to understand the rationale behind the AI's decisions.
No more black boxes, in other words. People need to know what's going on behind the scenes.
Precisely. And in certain cases, high-risk AI systems may also require human oversight or intervention to prevent unintended consequences. It's all about finding that balance between harnessing the power of AI while maintaining human control and accountability.
These requirements seem comprehensive and well-designed, but how does this compare to the approach in China and the US? Are they also implementing similar safeguards for high-risk AI?
Well, as we've discussed, China has adopted a more sector-specific approach. While they don't have a single overarching framework like the EU AI Act, their individual AI laws often address high-risk applications within specific sectors.
Can you provide an example of how that works in practice?
Certainly. China's regulations on deep synthesis technology, for instance, require providers to obtain consent for creating and distributing synthetic content that features individuals. They also mandate clear labeling of such content to prevent the spread of misinformation. This directly addresses the high-risk nature of deepfakes and their potential to cause harm.
So they're taking targeted measures
Mhm.
to mitigate the specific risks associated with deepfakes. What about the U.S.? How do they handle high-risk AI applications?
The U.S. approach, as we've touched on, is more fragmented. There's no single unified federal law dealing specifically with high-risk AI. Instead, various existing laws and regulatory bodies play a role in mitigating those risks.
So it's more of a patchwork of regulations with
Yeah.
different agencies stepping in, depending on the specific application. Can you give me a couple examples
Yeah.
of how that plays out?
Of course. For instance, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, regulates the use of AI in medical devices, ensuring their safety and effectiveness before they reach the market. Likewise, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, is responsible for setting safety standards for autonomous vehicles, which are considered high risk due to their potential impact on road safety.
It sounds like the U.S., while lacking a comprehensive AI law, is still addressing high-risk AI applications through existing channels and regulatory expertise.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, in the U.S. is actively developing voluntary AI risk management frameworks and standards. These frameworks are designed to help organizations proactively manage AI risks and promote responsible AI practices.
So there's movement in the U.S. towards a more structured approach to AI risk management, even if it's not through a single overarching law. It's clear that the global AI landscape is constantly evolving, with each region taking its own path. But what's certain is that AI regulation is here to stay, and will only become more critical in the years to come.
I couldn't agree more. For compliance officers, staying informed about these developments is absolutely paramount. It requires vigilance, adaptability, and a willingness to navigate this complex and constantly changing world of AI law.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring different regulatory approaches, and focusing on the crucial concepts of prohibited AI and high-risk AI. But there's another layer to this discussion, which is how organizations can practically navigate this complex world and ensure compliance. We'll tackle that in the final part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Compliance Officer's Playbook podcast. We've been on quite a journey exploring the global landscape of AI law. We've seen how different regions are approaching this challenge, from the EU's Comprehensive AI Act to China's more targeted approach and the U.S.'s patchwork of existing regulations.
Yeah, it's a dynamic and complex field, and as we've discussed, staying informed is just the first step. The real challenge lies in translating all this information into actionable strategies for compliance.
Right? It's one thing to understand the theory, but how do organizations actually put these principles into practice? What are some of the key challenges they face when trying to navigate this evolving regulatory environment?
Well, I think one of the biggest hurdles is simply keeping up with the pace of change. The AI law landscape is incredibly dynamic, with new regulations and guidelines emerging all the time. It can be overwhelming to track these developments across multiple jurisdictions, especially for organizations operating globally.
It sounds like a full-time job in itself.
It certainly can be. That's why it's crucial for organizations to establish robust AI governance frameworks. These frameworks provide a structured approach to monitoring regulatory changes, assessing their impact, and adapting AI systems and practices accordingly. It's about building a system that allows you to proactively manage AI compliance rather than constantly playing catch-up.
So it's not just about knowing the rules, but also having a system in place to implement them effectively.
Precisely. And this requires a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach. It can't just be the legal team's responsibility. You need buy-in and participation from across the organization, involving data scientists, engineers, compliance professionals, and leadership.
It's almost like building a compliance ecosystem, specifically for AI, with all these different parts working together.
That's a great way to put it, and the complexity multiplies for organizations operating across borders. They have to navigate a patchwork of AI laws, each with its own nuances and requirements.
That brings us back to the issue of harmonization, or rather the lack thereof that we've been discussing. Is there any hope for greater alignment in global AI regulations in the future? It seems like that would make everyone's lives a lot easier.
Well, there's certainly efforts underway to promote international cooperation and convergence in AI governance organizations, like the OECD and the Global Partnership on AI are working to develop common principles and guidelines.
So there's at least a possibility of a more unified approach down the line.
It's possible, but for now, organizations need to be prepared to operate in a world of regulatory fragmentation. This means adopting a flexible and adaptable approach, constantly assessing the evolving landscape and adjusting their AI compliance strategies accordingly.
It sounds like organizations need to be as agile as the AI technology itself, constantly learning, evolving, and adapting to new challenges.
Exactly. It's a fast-paced field, and compliance needs to keep pace.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've explored the global tapestry of AI law, from the broad strokes of the EU's AI Act to the more targeted approaches in China and the US. We've delved into the complexities of prohibited AI and high-risk AI, and talked about the practical challenges of staying compliant in this evolving landscape.
It's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope our listeners have gained valuable insights into this crucial and rapidly developing area.
Me too. AI is no longer a futuristic concept. It's woven into the fabric of our lives. And as AI continues to advance and permeate every sector, the importance of robust, ethical, and adaptable legal frameworks will only become more pronounced.
I couldn't agree more. It's both an exciting and challenging time to be working in this field.
Absolutely. To all our listeners out there, we encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and be prepared for the ongoing evolution of AI law. And if you found this deep dive into the world of AI law helpful, be sure to subscribe to the Compliance Officer's Playbook podcast for more insights into crucial compliance topics. Until next time.